Most people spend their entire lives trying to build wealth from the roof down. They chase income. They chase investment returns. They chase opportunities. And then, year after year, they find themselves standing in exactly the same place, wondering why nothing is holding together. What almost no one realizes is that this problem is not new. It is not a product of modern economics or inflation or bad luck. It was already fully documented nearly 3,000 years ago, not in a financial textbook, but in the oldest wisdom literature in the world. The book of Proverbs does not describe prosperity as a single event. It describes it as a structure, a building. And like every building ever constructed, it stands or falls depending on what it is built upon. There are 7 of these foundations, 7 pillars. And the disturbing truth, the one that explains why so many intelligent, hard-working people never seem to arrive where they believed they were going, is that most people never discover what those pillars are. Or worse, they discover them one at a time, in the wrong order, and still never understand how they connect. By the end of this video, you will understand how these 7 pillars work together, not as a list of virtues, not as religious obligations, but as an architectural system, one that has been tested across centuries, across civilizations, and across every economic condition imaginable. Before we continue, if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do that now. And write in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this message is reaching. Here is the question that sits beneath almost every financial struggle. Why do people who work hard, who save, who try to do the right things, still end up fragile? Not poor, necessarily, but fragile. One unexpected event away from losing everything they built. One bad year away from starting over. One crisis away from discovering that what looked like stability was actually just momentum. The conventional answer is that they didn't earn enough, or they didn't invest wisely enough, or they faced circumstances beyond their control. But Proverbs offers a different diagnosis entirely. The writer of Proverbs, and the tradition attributes most of it to Solomon, the wealthiest and wisest king in the ancient world, did not see financial fragility as primarily an income problem. He saw it as a structural problem. People were building, yes, but they were building without foundations. The image he uses repeatedly is architectural: a house, a household, a dynasty. These are not metaphors chosen randomly. In the ancient world, the household was the economic unit. The family structure was the business structure, and a household that collapsed financially did not just lose money. It lost everything: its land, its name, its future. Solomon understood that the difference between households that endured and households that collapsed was not primarily about how much wealth they accumulated. It was about what that wealth was built on. And that is where the 7 pillars come in. To understand what Proverbs is actually teaching about wealth, you need to understand who wrote it, in what world, and for what purpose. Solomon ruled Israel at the peak of its ancient power, roughly 970 to 930 BCE. He controlled trade routes between Egypt, Arabia, and Mesopotamia. His kingdom generated revenue from commerce, tribute, taxation, and agricultural production on a scale that was exceptional for that era. The historian Josephus, drawing on ancient records, described Solomon's annual income as exceeding what most modern readers would recognize as hundreds of millions in contemporary value. But Solomon's reputation was not built on his wealth. It was built on his wisdom. And the distinction matters, because in the biblical tradition, and in the ancient Near Eastern tradition more broadly, wisdom and wealth were understood as inseparable in a very specific way. Wisdom was not the reward for wealth. Wisdom was the condition that made wealth sustainable. This is not a moral platitude, it was an observation about how economies actually worked. The book of Proverbs is, at its core, a curriculum. It was the instruction given to young men who were being prepared for leadership, in households, in commerce, in governance. The Talmud would later formalize this connection between wisdom training and economic preparation, and the Jewish commercial tradition that emerged across centuries was in many ways a direct continuation of what Proverbs was already teaching. What Proverbs was trying to transmit was not a set of moral commands. It was a model of how durable prosperity is actually constructed. That model has 7 layers. The first pillar is also the most misunderstood, which is precisely why it is the most important to get right. Proverbs states it plainly and repeats it multiple times. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And most modern readers, hearing that phrase, either dismiss it as religious language irrelevant to financial life or reduce it to a vague instruction to be pious. Neither interpretation captures what Solomon was actually describing. In the ancient wisdom tradition, the fear of the Lord was not primarily an emotional state. It was an epistemological position, a way of orienting yourself toward reality. It meant recognizing that there are laws governing the world, moral, relational, economic laws, that operate independently of your preferences, your intentions, or your cleverness. The person who fears the Lord in Proverbs is the person who takes those laws seriously, who understands that certain actions produce certain consequences regardless of whether you believe they will, who approaches life with the awareness that the universe has a structure and that structure cannot be cheated. In modern economic terms, you might describe this as a commitment to operating within reality rather than within your own projections. The entrepreneur who refuses to falsify numbers, even when the short-term pressure to do so is enormous. The investor who refuses to pursue returns that violate the logic of sustainable value creation. The business owner who prices honestly even when dishonesty would be more profitable in the short term. Solomon's observation was that these individuals, the ones who operated within the structure of reality rather than against it, consistently produced outcomes that compounded over time, while the clever ones, the ones who thought they could outsmart the system, consistently produced outcomes that eventually collapsed. This is the foundation. Everything built without it will eventually reveal the absence. But the fear of the Lord by itself does not build prosperity. It only creates the conditions in which the next pillar can operate. If the fear of the Lord is the foundation, wisdom is the first wall. And in Proverbs, wisdom is described in a way that most readers do not expect. It is not described as knowledge. It is not described as intelligence. It is described as a skill. The Hebrew word used throughout Proverbs, chokmah, was the same word used to describe the craftsmen who built the tabernacle, the artisans who worked gold and silver for the temple, the navigators who guided ships across open water. Wisdom, in the biblical sense, is the capacity to take raw material and produce something of lasting value from it. Applied to financial life, this means something specific. Wisdom is not the accumulation of information about money. It is the developed ability to make sound judgments about people, about timing, about opportunity, about risk, under conditions of uncertainty. Solomon's entire court was structured around the cultivation of this capacity. Advisors were tested not on what they knew, but on the quality of the judgments they produced. The Talmudic tradition that would develop centuries later placed enormous emphasis on the same quality, the ability to reason carefully through complex situations without being deceived by surface appearances. The modern equivalent is not a degree or a certification. It is the slow, deliberate development of judgment through experience, reflection, and instruction. The person who reads contracts carefully before signing them, who asks the second and third question before the first has been fully answered, who has learned to distinguish between what something looks like and what it actually is. Wisdom compounds. Each decision made well makes the next difficult decision slightly more navigable. Each error understood, not just regretted, adds a layer of discernment that was not there before. But here is where most people stop. They understand the value of wisdom. They may even pursue it. And then they encounter the third pillar and discover that wisdom without it produces nothing. Proverbs is remarkably direct about labor. There is almost no ambiguity in its language. The hand of the diligent will rule, while the slothful will be put to forced labor. A slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. Whoever works his land will have plenty of bread, but he who follows worthless pursuits lacks sense. These are not encouragements. They are observations about how economic reality functions. What Proverbs identifies as diligence is not simply working long hours. The distinction it draws, and this is where the ancient text becomes surprisingly precise, is between work that is directed and work that is scattered. Between consistent, focused application toward meaningful ends and the kind of frenetic activity that produces the feeling of effort without the reality of progress. The ant, which Proverbs famously uses as a model, does not work randomly. It works according to season. It stores in summer for winter. It executes a plan that extends beyond the immediate moment. Solomon himself, in the construction of the temple, oversaw a project that took 7 years and involved tens of thousands of workers. The organization of that labor, the management of resources, the sequencing of tasks, the distribution of specialization was an expression of directed work at scale. In the ancient Jewish economic tradition, this principle took a very specific form. Jewish communities across the diaspora, from Babylon to Rome to medieval Europe, consistently developed trades and professions that required extended periods of skill development. The Talmud explicitly discouraged parents from raising children without teaching them a productive trade, connecting diligent labor not just to individual prosperity, but to communal survival. Directed, consistent work is the engine. But an engine without a governor will destroy itself, which brings us to the fourth pillar, one that almost no one frames correctly. Here is something that the financial literature rarely discusses, but that Proverbs treats as central. The question of prosperity is not only about how much you produce, it is about what happens to what you produce. Solomon describes the faithful steward, in contrast to the wasteful one, not as someone who is simply frugal. Frugality by itself appears in Proverbs as a kind of poverty in disguise. The person who refuses to invest, who hoards rather than allocates, who mistakes the preservation of current resources for the building of future ones, this person also fails to build lasting wealth. Faithful stewardship, in the Proverbs framework, is the capacity to hold resources as a trust, to manage them in ways that honor their potential rather than simply protecting their current form. This is where ancient Israel's agricultural economy provides a precise illustration. A farmer who faithfully manages his land, who rotates crops, who preserves soil quality, who plans his harvests against future seasons, produces more over 20 years than a farmer who extracts maximum yield for 5 years and then faces depleted land. The principle is identical in any domain. The Hebrew concept of picadon, the deposit held in trust, formalized this understanding in legal terms. Resources entrusted to you carry an obligation, not just to preserve them, but to return them in better condition than you received them. The modern application is not complicated, but it requires a shift in how most people frame their relationship to money, not as something they own absolutely, to be spent or saved at will, but as something they are responsible for, to themselves, to their families, to the future. This is also where the fifth pillar becomes essential, because faithful stewardship, without what comes next, produces wealth that stays in one place. This is the pillar that stops most people, because it appears on the surface to contradict everything that precedes it. If diligence builds resources and stewardship protects them, why would generosity, which deploys them outward, be a foundation of prosperity rather than a threat to it? Proverbs addresses this directly, and the logic it offers is not sentimental. It is economic. One gives freely yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give and only suffers want. Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed. A generous man will prosper. He who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. The mechanism Solomon is describing was not invisible. It was observable in the commercial networks of the ancient world. A merchant who dealt generously, who was known to give fair weight, to extend reasonable terms to struggling counterparties, to share knowledge of trade routes, to support artisans in lean seasons, built a network of goodwill that functioned as a form of social capital. When that merchant faced difficulty, and every merchant eventually faced difficulty, the network responded. The Dead Sea Scrolls and early Talmudic sources document a specific practice among Jewish communities of the Second Temple period. The tzedakah box in the synagogue, which was not a charity collection but a community economic stabilization mechanism. Wealthy members contributed, struggling members drew from it, but with the expectation that they would contribute again when they recovered. This created a resilience across the community that no individual household could have generated alone. Generosity in this framework is not a moral luxury. It is a network-building investment, one that returns in forms that cannot be predicted, but that consistently compounds across a life. But generosity without the sixth pillar becomes vulnerability. And the sixth pillar is where the ancient wisdom tradition becomes surprisingly modern. The Hebrew word arum, translated throughout Proverbs as prudence, carries a specific meaning that most translations flatten. It does not mean caution. It does not mean conservatism. It means the capacity to see ahead, to anticipate consequences before they arrive, to recognize patterns in the present that will determine what the future produces. Proverbs contrasts the prudent person with the simple one. And the distinction is not intellectual. The simple person is not unintelligent. He is reactive. He responds to what is immediately in front of him. He borrows against tomorrow because today is difficult. He spends what arrives because it is there. He enters agreements without reading them because the other party seems trustworthy. The prudent person sees the same immediate situation but asks a different set of questions. Where does this lead? What does this commit me to? What happens if the favorable conditions change? What am I not seeing? Solomon's description of the sluggard, one of the most psychologically precise portraits in ancient literature, is essentially a portrait of a person who has never developed the capacity to hold the future in mind while navigating the present. He intends to act. He plans to act. He is perpetually on the verge of acting. But the future never quite arrives in a form that demands the action he has been avoiding. The commercial guilds of medieval Jewish Europe, documented in the Cairo Geniza, an extraordinary archive of economic records spanning 5 centuries, consistently practiced a form of prudence that shaped their remarkable resilience. They diversified across geographies, trades, and currencies at a time when most merchants concentrated their exposure. They understood, and this was not instinct but transmitted wisdom, that concentration amplifies both gains and losses, and that durable wealth requires protection against catastrophic loss more than optimization for maximum return. This explains a great deal about why certain families and communities maintained prosperity across generations while others rose and fell. They had learned to see ahead. And that capacity to see ahead, combined with everything that precedes it, creates the conditions for the 7th pillar, the one that most people never even consider until it is too late to build. Proverbs states it with a simplicity that deserves to be held without explanation for a moment. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, not to his children, to his children's children. This single verse contains an entire framework for how Solomon understood time, responsibility, and the purpose of wealth. The average modern financial plan extends perhaps 15 to 20 years into the future. The ancient household in the Proverbs tradition planned across generations, not in the abstract but concretely. What knowledge would be transmitted? What relationships would be cultivated? What assets would be structured to endure beyond the current owner? What values, practices, and disciplines would be taught to children young enough that they would not remember learning them? Nehemiah, who rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile, provides one of the most striking examples of generational thinking in the biblical record. He returned to a city in ruins, not because he expected to profit personally from the reconstruction, but because he understood that the city was the vessel of a future he would not live to see. The work he did was not for himself. It was for the generation that would inherit what he was building. This is not sentiment. In economic terms, generational thinking fundamentally changes the decisions you make today. A person who expects to transfer wealth to grandchildren makes different investments than a person who expects to spend everything before they die. A person who expects to transmit values makes different parenting decisions. A person who builds a business with the intention of handing it to the next generation builds differently than one who intends to sell it. Legacy is not simply what you leave behind. It is a framework that shapes what you build in the first place. The 7 pillars were not a theoretical system. They were lived and tested. Solomon's own reign offers the most complete illustration. The wealth of his kingdom was not built on conquest, though Israel controlled significant territory. It was built on commerce. Solomon negotiated trading partnerships with Hiram of Tyre, with the Queen of Sheba, with Egyptian pharaohs. He controlled the spice routes and the copper trade. He built a merchant fleet that operated from the Red Sea port of Etzion-Geber. What made all of this possible was not Solomon's personal genius. It was the institutional culture of his court, a culture built on precisely the 7 principles Proverbs describes. Officials who feared the consequences of corruption, advisors whose wisdom was tested before they were trusted, workers who were directed and fairly compensated, resources managed as trusts rather than personal property, a king who, at least in the early years of his reign, gave generously to the temple, to the poor, and to foreign dignitaries in ways that built alliances rather than draining them. Prudent administrators who planned agricultural storage and distribution against famine, and a deliberate project of transmitting that system through the wisdom literature, through the education of the next generation, so that it would outlast the individuals who built it. The historical record of Jewish commercial resilience across the medieval period provides the longitudinal test. Communities expelled from country after country, from England in 1290, from France repeatedly, from Spain in 1492, consistently rebuilt their economic networks within 1 or 2 generations, not because they had hidden reserves, but because the pillars they carried were intellectual and relational, not material. They could not be expelled. They could not be confiscated. They were transmitted through teaching and practice, embedded in a culture that had been shaped for millennia by the very wisdom literature we have been examining. What you can begin today is not complicated, but it requires honesty. Start by identifying which pillar you have been ignoring. Most people have some relationship with diligence. They work. Some have developed aspects of wisdom through experience. Many practice generosity in moments of abundance, but very few have built all 7. And the system only works as a system. If the fear of the Lord, the commitment to operating within reality's actual structure rather than the structure you prefer, is absent, every other pillar becomes susceptible to self-deception. You can work hard in the wrong direction for decades and call it diligence. If wisdom has not been deliberately cultivated, through reading, through mentorship, through the honest analysis of past decisions, then diligence will produce effort without discernment. If stewardship has not been established, a clear understanding of where every resource goes and why, then whatever generosity you practice will drain resources you needed for something else. If prudence has not been developed, the habit of asking what comes next, what this commits you to, what you are not seeing, then the other pillars will all be exposed to risks you failed to anticipate. And if legacy has never been considered, if your financial decisions are entirely oriented toward your own lifetime, then the structure you build has no intention of outlasting you. And structures with no intention of lasting rarely do. Begin by auditing your own household against these 7 pillars, not to feel guilty, but to understand clearly what is present, what is partial, and what is entirely absent. That audit alone will tell you more than any financial plan built without it. If this message made sense to you, share this video with someone in your networks, especially on Facebook. This information might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. We started with an observation that most people spend their lives trying to build wealth from the roof down. Now you understand what that means with precision. The roof is income. The roof is returns on investment. The roof is the visible measure of financial life that everyone can see and compare. And the reason people build from the roof down is that the roof is what others can see. The pillars are invisible until the structure fails. The 7 pillars of Proverbs are not 7 separate habits. They form a single architecture. The fear of the Lord establishes the relationship with reality that makes everything else possible. Wisdom develops the judgment required to navigate it. Diligence provides the consistent force that builds across time. Stewardship ensures that what is built is not immediately lost. Generosity creates the network and the relationships that no individual effort can generate alone. Prudence protects the entire structure from the risks that optimism and urgency conspire to hide. And legacy gives the entire project a timeline that extends beyond the builder's own life, which changes fundamentally the quality of everything built. Solomon described wisdom building her house with 7 pillars, and the image he chose was not accidental. A pillar does not merely support a roof, it transfers load. Each pillar carries a portion of the weight that the entire structure must bear. Remove one, and the load does not disappear. It redistributes unevenly onto what remains, and what remains will eventually fail under a weight it was never designed to carry alone. This is why so many people who work hard, who earn well, who do so many things right, still end up with structures that collapse under pressure. They were never building with all 7 pillars. They were trying to make 6 do the work of 7, or 4 do the work of 6, and the structure held until it didn't. The builders Solomon admired were not the ones who built the tallest houses. They were the ones who built houses that were still standing when their grandchildren's grandchildren were old. That is what it means to build with wisdom.